Hello, and welcome to today's event, From Recovery to Resilience, Disaster Management in the Era of Benevolent AI. I'm Mark Funkhauser, publisher of Governing Magazine, and I'm excited to serve as moderator for today's event. And I just want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next 60 minutes. Before we begin, a couple of brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass it along to colleagues. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and you can participate in Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send in your questions as they come up throughout the presentation. Our speakers will address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the close of our webinar today. If you would like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also, during today's webinar, you will be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Please use the hashtag GovLive to connect with your peers across the governing platform via Twitter. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd like to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar but would like to complete the survey as much as you can, please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the Help button at the bottom of the console. Joining me today to discuss this very timely topic are Craig Fugate, Ray Mueller, and Aram Sahakian. Craig Fugate is the Chief Emergency Management Officer for OneConcern, a Palo Alto-based machine learning company with a mission to save lives and livelihoods before, during, and after natural disasters. Craig served as President Barack Obama's FEMA administrator from May 2009 to January 2017. Previously, he served as Florida Governor Jeb Bush's Emergency Management Director from 2001 to 2009. Craig led FEMA during multiple record-breaking disaster years and oversaw the federal government's response to major events such as the Joplin and Moore tornadoes, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Matthew, and the 2016 Louisiana flooding. Mr. Fugate set a clear and compelling vision, mission, and priorities for FEMA and relentlessly drove the agency to achieve better outcomes for survivors. FEMA's effectiveness in dealing with more than 500 presidentially declared major disasters and emergencies under Mr. Fugate's leadership restored the faith of the American people in the federal government's ability to respond to disasters. Prior to his tenure at FEMA, Mr. Fugate was widely praised for his management under Governor Jeb Bush of the devastating effects of the 2004 and 2005 hurricane seasons. Ray Mueller serves as Vice President of Government Relations and Business Development at OneConcern. Prior to joining OneConcern, Ray was Managing Director of International at an education technology company, managing the company's expansion into Asia and the Middle East. Previously, Ray worked as Chief of Staff to a prominent elected official in the Silicon Valley and served as a Regional Emergency Services Council. Ray currently serves as a City Council member and is a former mayor in the Silicon Valley. Ray holds a Juris Doctor from the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of California, Berkeley. Aram Sahakian is the General Manager of the Emergency Management Department for the City of Los Angeles. He was appointed by Mayor Eric Garcetti as General Manager of the Emergency Management Department in 2016. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Sahakian led the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation's Special Traffic Operations and Emergency Response Division, where he managed emergency response and major special events for over 2 decades. RM has cultivated a broad network of relationships with public and private sector entities, community organizations, neighborhood councils, and grassroots stakeholders through his work. Many successful citywide initiatives managing multiple stakeholder situations. RM has served as incident commander for dozens of major incidents in a unified command structure along with the LAPD and the LAFD, including the 2013 LAX shooting, the 2008 Metrolink Chatsworth Railway disaster, 2008 Merrick and Cessnon wildfires, and the 1994 Northridge earthquake. He has also served in close coordination with other city, state, and federal agencies for U.S. presidential motorcades, political conventions, and gatherings, annual awards shows and sporting events, the transportation of the Space Shuttle Endeavour, and the 2015 Special Olympics, and the 405 freeway closure, Carmageddon. So, I will pass it over to Craig now as he starts the presentation.
Well, hello, everybody. As we go through the scenarios of what's going on, I wanted to look at today's emergency management needs. In my career, we've seen more and more disasters, including the frequency of events increasing, but also the severity of events. And so if you just look at last year from the National Weather Service, what NOAA reported was of the 16 events that reached over $1 billion, most of those involved weather-related events from drought to wildfires, but also notably 3 record-setting hurricanes, numerous flooding events. And one of our challenges has been, as we continue to see the increasing cost of disasters, is what's the future hold? And we know that looking backwards at our weather data isn't really preparing us because, the term 100-year flood event seems to be occurring almost weekly across the nation. And we know that we're seeing weather events that we have no historical record for. Again, when you have 3 record-setting hurricanes, that is definitely not something we've seen on a regular basis. Those disasters last year, the accumulated cost and counting is over $300 billion. And as we see not only the cost increasing, but the frequency of increasing disasters, we're having to really challenge ourselves that in building better systems to respond to these disasters, what else can we do? And we know that there's a lot of things from mitigation and other programs that we can reduce the impacts and severity of storms. But one of the challenges has been what gives us the best return on investment? And how do we look at this information? And that's really where I was excited to be asked to join One Concern. At FEMA, in many cases, the tools we had were developed in the 90s. They gave us ballpark estimates, but they, in many cases, could not give us what I would call actionable information. We knew something was bad, but we couldn't always tell you, well, what can you do about it? And as we looked at our projects and we looked at how we were investing our mitigation dollars, it didn't always give us the best outcome. Our ability to model and look at these hazards now provide both better situational awareness for response, but I think it's in an area that we'll actually have the greatest opportunity to change outcomes, and that is providing high-resolution model inputs into projects to look at our resiliency against our threats, but also coupled to climate change so that we're not just looking at our past impacts, we're actually looking at how we mitigate future risk. And so this is an area that One Concern is very much involved in. It is our core philosophy that with better information and data, we can change outcome and save lives. And the ability to provide that at a high enough resolution that's hyper-local so that local communities and decision makers can look at, what does sea level rise mean in my community over the next 25 to 50 years? Now, what kind of investment decisions can I make to buy down my risk? What areas of my community have the greatest flood potential, and where can I make those investments to reduce those impacts while not neglecting the underserved and underrepresented residents? Another thing that we find that with Benevolent AI is we can look at so many different factors simultaneously that we can help lift up the areas of greatest vulnerabilities, not just those that have the greatest visibility day to day, and ensure that as we make our decisions, we're serving our whole community, not just those that tend to get the most attention. So this is, to me, something that we've been looking for in emergency management for a long time, is how do we look at mitigation in a way that gives us the visibility, the scalability, and the information to make the best informed decisions, to show decision makers and move beyond a project by project. We now know that for every dollar we invest pre-disaster mitigation, we can oftentimes see up to a $6 return. But we also know the more that mitigation is targeted, the even greater savings can occur. And so I'd like to turn it over now to one of our executives and one of my partners at One Concern, Ray Mueller, to talk about more in depth what we're doing. Ray?
Thank you, Craig. It's an honor to serve on this panel with you. So I'll be going over now with you all what our mission is really and what science we're using actually to solve these problems that Craig talked about. So at One Concern, our engineers are building artificial intelligence tools to empower emergency response professionals, land use planners, elected officials, and the private sector to make the best decisions how to use valuable resources to build holistic resilience to catastrophic natural hazard events. To achieve that goal, we've developed three powerful modules to assist evidence-based decision-making. The first module is Live, which provides highly accurate information as a natural hazard event is actually unfolding. The second module is Simulation, which allows decision makers to simulate natural hazard events to train, identify gaps, and plan appropriately. And then the third module is Resilience, which empowers agencies to simulate multiple events and aggregate that data on jurisdictional risk maps that, when used in combination, inform comprehensive evidence-based policy decision-making. So at this point, I often get questions, well, what is machine learning and artificial intelligence? For some folks, the view of the Terminator walking through the door is actually a bit scary. And that's not what we do, actually. That's why we call what we do benevolent intelligence. It's used to save lives and to help inform how to go ahead and reach underserved populations. And so all of these three modules I talked about, Live, Simulation, Resilience, are driven by state-of-the-art artificial intelligence and machine learning. Artificial intelligence is the broad concept of machines being able to carry out tasks in a smart way. These machines actually simulate the processes that take place in the human brain. Machine learning is a specific application of AI based around that idea that we really should just be able to give machines access to data and let them learn from themselves. An example I like to share with folks regarding to go ahead and explain these concepts are really based around a bowl full of apples. So in the 1950s, engineers were really trying to teach computers how to go ahead and make logic-based decisions. For instance, could you teach a computer how to play a game of chess? And it was really, everyone remembers those games of Big Blue taking on the chess champion to see who could win. Just so happened around that same time in the 1950s, neuropsychology started to develop as a field, and that's important. We'll get back to that later. By the 1990s, 2000 time period, machines were moving much faster, and calculations were happening much quicker, and artificial intelligence was really starting to evolve as a field. At that time, what engineers were trying to do was could you teach a computer how to make a qualitative-based decision? So the example is a bowl full of apples. And what the engineers were trying to teach a computer to do is you'd have a bowl full of apples, and you would go ahead and engineer in the computer to go ahead and determine whether or not an apple is right. And to do so, the engineer would list all sorts of features that we all thought was indicative of a ripe apple. So an example would be, is the apple red? How shiny is the apple? Is there any bruising on the apple? What's the red to yellow ratio color on the apple? And they would list all of these different features and then show that program apple after apple in training sets so that the computer could get the platform could get very efficient at identifying the ripe apple. And that's the type of technology, frankly, that we see today in agriculture, in our supermarkets. That's not unlike the technology that, frankly, we see in many emergency response applications, all based on human insight. What happened in the 2010-2011 time period is that they realized we'd hit a wall. And what that wall was is that computers weren't actually, artificial intelligence modules weren't actually learning for themselves. Rather, they were dependent upon human insight. And they really realized that, very frankly, to advance the science, they had to go back and really look at the human brain. And so what they did was they went back, and we've all seen the MRIs of human brains and where different parts of the brain lights up. And theorists postulated that actually when you look at something like, for example, a pen sitting in front of you, you actually don't immediately recognize it as a pen. Actually what happens is your brain picks that pen apart into sub-features. What color is the pen, how long is it? And then it takes all those features apart and then puts them back together again and compares it to the memory section of your brain. And the faster you do that is a section of IQ. So engineers began to create algorithms that mimics that process. And so now what happens is instead of we'll go back to the bowl full of apples. Instead of an engineer typing in all of the different types of features that make a ripe apple, today what happens with cutting edge artificial intelligence is instead through this use of artificial intelligence, you show the platform a ripe apple. And now the artificial intelligence begins to list all of the features itself. Over time, after showing ripe apple after ripe apple after ripe apple to the platform, what engineers discovered is that the artificial intelligence platform was actually much more capable of identifying features that we had no idea was indicative of result. So instead of just 6 features, now you're looking at 152 features which make up a ripe apple. What this means in combination is that each one of these different features intersecting each other on a plane create many more dimensions than we ever knew was possible to examine whether or not an apple was ripe. And so this is the type of technology that we use today at One Concern. Machine learning captures hidden trends in data. So what that means is, for instance, when we look at a past natural hazard event, we'll show, we can go ahead and analyze what happens in an earthquake by showing earthquake after earthquake and damage set after damage set to our AI platform. By doing so, our platform learns insights we never knew was possible in terms of what was indicative of whether or not there'll be damage in an area or to a building, or very frankly, in the natural environment as well. And then what it allows us to do is all of those different features, all of those different trends that the AI finds, allows us to predict with incredibly high accuracy in the actual live event scenario. Applying this technology, AI empowers significant improvements into resilience. So in the live response scenario, what ends up happening, specifically an example would be an earthquake, is we actually can take the rupture of the earthquake, model that rupture through the natural environment and all of the different features that the AI platform has picked up in the natural environment, model that to the base of each building, and then model damage throughout that building, which gives you a highly accurate picture of damage within your jurisdictional region. Now, we can do that in live response, or we can do that in simulation mode. In simulation mode, you actually can pick the place on the fault line and run the earthquake, and then look what damage looks like through the region. In pre-disaster mitigation, what you can do then is go ahead and actually start to go ahead and make changes to the built environment and run the simulation again to see what is the best use of your resource in order to mitigate for that disaster. In post-disaster recovery, you can use those same insights to figure out how to go ahead and rebuild. So just to go over this again, in live response, AI improves the accuracy of impact of predictions in real time. It predicts infrastructure and cascading effects. So you can go ahead and we can look at individual pieces of infrastructure or aggregate that damage across a block level. What we can also do is layer multiple filters on top of that information on anything that you may want to see. So for example, we can look at vulnerable populations. We can look at senior populations. We can look at how damage in a region affects fuel transport and what the cascading effect may be of that across the region. We can also update, and what's very important to know is we can update damage and inundation estimates. And the way we do that, and the example I would use would be in our flood module. For instance, when you're predicting inundation levels in an area, sometimes things aren't predictable, such as whether or not a tree may fall, and affecting how water flows in the area. The way we account for that is actually using belief propagation, which is a cutting-edge AI technique, which basically listens to the dynamic inputs coming in as to how water is moving in an area. And if there's something that doesn't match what the predicted model initially indicated, listening to those dynamic inputs, it then ripples that information throughout the platform. You can similarly use this information to go ahead and do preparedness and create action plans throughout your jurisdiction. So no longer do we have to go ahead and pretend City Hall is on fire, but now we can actually look and see what would actually happen in a live scenario. And again, we've already talked about mitigation, understanding risks holistically, how to best use your taxpayer dollars in response to those things. And finally, recovery. We no longer need to continue to build back to the last disaster, but rather we can go ahead and run multiple simulations of natural hazard events in an area and figure and determine which is the best way to go ahead and build back to be resilient for the future. With that, I'd just like to go ahead and introduce ARM, who we are just so fortunate to be working with at One Consent.
Thank you, Ray. Also an honor to be on the panel with Craig and yourself. So now let's talk about what is the city of Los Angeles doing with the software, with the AI, and the details of it. The slide you're looking at right now on your screen shows earthquake faults in the Southern California region. And dozens of these faults, they are major fault lines that can trigger major earthquakes. So we know it is not a matter of if we're going to have a major earthquake. When are we going to have it? And the chances that it's going to happen in our lifetime is very high. Again, any one of these could trigger a 7+ magnitude earthquake with grave consequences. And please also bear in mind that earthquakes are no-notice events. We don't have the luxury of last-minute preparations or last-minute evacuations like for hurricanes and other weather-related disasters. If you look at the Great Southern California shakeout, and this was based on a potential 7.8 magnitude on the southern San Andreas fault, and this is an exercise that we did several times in the past, it shows widespread damage. We're talking about thousands of fatalities and injuries, mega fires, blocks at a time, throughout the basin, densely populated areas, severe damage to our infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of population that are displaced. So you can only imagine, for the emergency managers that are listening in, you can only imagine the mass care and shelter challenges that we will be facing post a major earthquake. So preparing resilient communities is key to our survival. No ifs and buts about it. And we saw this in recent days in these past emergencies and disasters that we had with the hurricanes and including the earthquake down in Mexico. The people that the first responders were community members, were neighbors, were family members. So preparing them is extremely important. So we are using OneConcern, this tool basically, in our preparedness, pre-disaster, and also post-disaster for response and recovery. Back, I believe it was in August 2017, yes, we signed a partnership with OneConcern. It's called Seismic Concern, to use this artificial intelligence to assist us in our planning and preparedness activities. My background is engineering, so I believe in artificial intelligence, and I really understand it, and I understand the accuracy of it. It's very accurate if the data that it's using is accurate, and the data that we're inputting to the system, it is accurate because it's based on facts. It's based on historical facts. So some of the departments that are using this include the building and safety, rec and parks. We have the fire department, obviously, the water and power, the mayor's office. They're using it to study the policy, the ordinance that they just passed for the soft structures. ITA, they have a huge infrastructure that could be impacted. That's the Information Technology Agency, the Housing Authority. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's 7 or 8 departments. I believe it's 8, and the slide says 8. So let's talk about how we're using this, and I hope I don't go over my time. Mark, you might want to stop me if I do, because I speak about this with passion. So the software, it allows us to do data-driven simulations of major earthquake scenarios, and then study and analyze the damage, the hazards, and then obviously identify the gaps and plan for their mitigations. And this method, it truly guides realistic solutions, and it allows us to prioritize our to-do list. It gives us a post-disaster situational awareness prior to the disaster. You know, I kind of comparing to having the exam before the test. And that gives you a huge advantage to get a good score. I mean, if you study, you do your homework, you have the test, and then you take the exams, you're going to get an A, hopefully. So our decisions now are data-driven, accurate data. They're efficient and educated. Not only they help us in building a resilient infrastructure and resilient communities, but also for the public safety agencies during a disaster and post-disaster to prepare and plan their tactical responses. And an example would be who needs to be rescued on priority, where the most in need people are, our vulnerable population are located, and what resources are needed and where to stage them pre-disaster. And so it is very important to do this also holding hands with your sister agencies. So I think there's a huge advantage that 8 of us in the city of LA were using this software, and each department is assessing their capabilities, and we're sharing this information because ultimately, myself as an emergency operations manager, we're sitting in the EOC during an activation, coordinating agency efforts and knowing their capabilities and knowing that their continuity of operations plan have been tested pre-disaster and they have mitigated the gaps is huge. It's like playing chess, knowing what your soldiers are capable of doing. In addition to that, the ease of requesting a simulation, and it's straightforward. It takes less than a minute to get the results back. It provides us impact at a city block level, and yesterday I was with the Gumbar on the call because now we're looking at the critical infrastructure level. So the block level, it tells you within a block what are the damages. It's a holistic picture, but You can also go in there and let's say you have critical infrastructure such as, I'll give you an example, our Wilshire 1 building, downtown LA, our fiber optics are fed to that building. If that building is damaged, we lose communications, period, including to the EOC, all the fiber goes there. So simulating an earthquake and studying the impacts to that specific building is huge. You can only imagine if we can mitigate and we can ensure that that building is standing after a major earthquake, right? So and communications, obviously, you guys know it's key for any disaster response and recovery. So in essence, we're receiving damage assessments immediately after the shake in our emergency operations center. And you know, this will, within minutes, we know how bad it is, versus doing windshield surveys, getting the helicopters up in the air. It takes a long time. And we can handle this at the local level. So, obviously, we're pushing also one concern, and they've been great working with us because we have a vision, and we want to exponentially and very quickly test the capabilities and improve product development also, and work with them to see what else they can do for us. So that synergy has been unbelievable. That's why we're so excited about it. So some of the slides that I'm going to show you, the next slides, it shows at what level, what kind of information you can receive. We've done so far 7 simulations. They're available to all 7 departments to assess their strengths and weaknesses, and you know, to understand worst case and realistic impact to our communities. They also provide information such as this next slide. If you look at it, I don't know if you can see it on your screen. It gives you total number of population. It gives you the average of the seniors in the area, the vulnerable population in the area. That's very important. Our goal has been to map out actually our vulnerable population, our elderly and people that are disabled, to be able to get a visual picture on how to respond, where to concentrate our resources in what specific communities. So these slides that you're looking at, they give you that information. The next one, I believe, the slide you're looking at, it shows a societal impact, what city blocks have high damage and have a significant senior population, or what city blocks have damage and significant low-income population. I'll give you an example. The Creek fire that we had recently, we had to evacuate 120,000 plus. Well, we were able to tell that our shelter capacity, we didn't need shelters to accommodate thousands and 10,000s of people, because we knew the demographics of the people evacuating. And sure enough, we activated 11 shelters, and out of the 11, only 5 were busy, and those 5 averaged only about 50 to 100 people. And because we knew that those people have the means to evacuate to hotels, and that's what happened. The hotels filled up. So that was a test that proved to us that this system is very accurate. Impacts on the different types of population demographics. Again, let's see what's the next slide here. This is the low income, the seniors, and the sky's the limit, by the way, to all the listeners. I mean, you can have all this as far as you have databases and information uploaded to this system. That's going to show up on the maps that you are simulating. So this one is showing residential versus commercial data, so impact on your business community. And you guys know that any recovery of post-disaster is essential to have its business district recover first. So again, a very important component. Where are the city blocks that have the highest damage? Then the social equity component of it. This slide is here, water and power, and I know they're doing a study. Basically, this was a post-earthquake And what DWP is doing right now, we know that there's a need for water distribution post a major disaster. So the locations of these points of distributions are essential, including the grocery sector, pharmaceutical sector. So the supply chain points of distributions are extremely important, that they're in safe locations. So I know DWP, they're using and simulating earthquakes to pick these locations, to identify these locations, and either to pre-position water distribution equipment or to build resilience hubs. And talking about resilience hub, I know that part of our resiliency plan is to establish resiliency hubs in our communities, and we're also using it for that. Now, potential future project, honestly, sky's the limit. I can talk for hours on that, but I'll mention a couple of them. We have our Ready Your LA neighborhood program that we're about to launch in May, and again, for the emergency managers, you know how difficult it is to engage our communities in preparedness. So what we're planning to do is shake at the block level, and then for us, a community is about 15 to 20 households that we bring together. We have different tools. We work with them. They use the tools to prepare them. So when we show them a visual of the impact of what would happen to their community post a major earthquake, it's an eye-opener. So we're getting better reaction, and their interest suddenly they're interested in preparedness because they can feel the impact. Some of the other project would be supply chain. We're working with academia down at USC. We have a project going on with the supply chains, the last mile, for example. That's extremely important, and we're doing some simulations to show the supply chain sector that, listen, we need to plan this. An example, the grocery sector, their points of distributions are in Riverside County. Every single one of them, they're on a major fault. So they're done. If there's a major earthquake, they're going to be completely damaged. So we're communicating this to the supply chain sector, to the grocery sector, so they can accordingly plan against them. So the list goes on, and I'm sure we're going to have questions on what other visions we have for the program, but I think I'm over my time, and I'm going to end it right now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Aram. And since we are getting to the time when we need to jump into questions, we're going to do that. Many of you have been asking about getting copies of today's presentation, and I wanted to tell you that within the next 48 hours, governing will provide all attendees with a link to the recording for your reference or to share with colleagues. All right, so let's go to the first question. So here, what types of data do we as users need to populate versus what's included in the data of the platform?
So I can go ahead and take that question. This is Ray.
Sure.
So the platform.
Yes.
The platform. Yeah, the platform actually comes with all of the natural built and all the natural environment data and all the built environment data ready to run. So this is not a major. This doesn't have to be a major data compilation for the jurisdiction that's using the platform. That being said, when we do move into a jurisdiction, we do actually want to sit down and see what data sets are available there, because we can go ahead then and sit down with our data scientists and run them through the platform to see if it improves the validation levels. Every data set that comes into it may have data that's indicative to the artificial intelligence and actually improve the accuracy of it. But we don't release the platform in an area unless it's already validating well over 85%. So that's something that we want to do. But I also want to make clear, when we say something validates over 85%, that's based on past and prior events, and it's somewhat akin to taking a pharmaceutical. So there may be instances where there may be something happen that wasn't predictable, such as a tree falling or something that wasn't captured in the built environment, something not permitted. But that's where belief propagation comes in and actually corrects that live. And then the other thing that we really want to do with the jurisdiction and move in is actually see what data sets that you want to filter on specifically. So one thing we don't have, for instance, if a jurisdiction wants to look at, say, how a diabetics in an area may be geographically spread out because they want to figure out where to go ahead and have insulin stores. That's something that we really have to work locally with the jurisdiction to build that filter on top of the platform. So so some of that's jurisdictional dependent, but the platform comes ready to roll for a jurisdiction.
All right, and it sounds like it's primarily demographic data and population data, like the percent of diabetics.
So we actually do have population and demographic data already in the platform. So that is publicly readily available. We spent a tremendous amount of time building those data sets, but there may be data, but every jurisdiction has data sets that actually may be helpful to go ahead and filter on top of.
Okay. Here's another question for you, Ray. How can one concern as a tool be useful for policymakers?
I think it's incredibly useful. I mean, there's a big push right now toward evidence-based policymaking, really nationwide. And so, for example, an example I can provide is if you were going to in a jurisdiction, you wanted to go ahead and measure your resilience. There have been many standards that have been promulgated by different agencies as to what resilience means. However, there aren't really metrics associated with that. By taking our platform and running simulations, you can understand a baseline of where you are currently at today. And then by going ahead and making mitigations on the platform, you can measure against those simulations where you need to get to and really make the best decision about how to use taxpayer resources in order to get to that end point that you want to achieve. The other thing to understand is that today, because current methods really haven't used this type of technology, you don't have the granularity that you have with the One Concern platform. So an example, which we're fond of talking about, would be, for instance, in flood. So in flood, the FEMA flood map really looks at the same amount of inundation across the geographic area assumed, but you don't get that granular level of what inundation is at specific points in the city. Using or in an area, using our simulation module, you can go ahead and actually look at what that specific inundation level is throughout your jurisdiction, and then figure out what mitigations need to be put in place in order to affect that, so that you're not constantly rebuilding back to the prior scenario.
All right. Here's a question for Craig. The rates and severity of natural disasters are increasing. How does One Concern think about climate change holistically?
Well, we look at, a lot of our data and our past history, but we also look at what we're seeing in the climate signals. And if you look at the recent climate assessment that came out, the National Academy of Science just put out their review of the assessment. We're still dealing with ranges, and we don't really have, in many cases, tools to communicate what kind of changes and impacts can we see in those ranges over the next couple of years. And I think that's where Ray was talking about. We're using machine learning and using belief propagation. You can actually take those ranges and now do your what-if scenarios at much higher resolution, and by factoring in the Benevolent AI, actually become more predictive of what these climate impacts could look like in your communities. We know that some of the work being done after Harvey and the hurricanes of this year is, people within the science community are looking at the increased rainfall events as a climate signal. And now they're starting to assign what percentage of increased rainfall are we seeing due to climate signals. And as you get that kind of data, we can incorporate that. And now instead of just looking at your past rainfall data, we can go, well, if we know that we're seeing a 10 to 15% increase in rainfall in tropical events, let's model that and look at your resiliency scores. And I think these are the kind of things that have always been very difficult. We talk about like sea level rise in generalities, but we're not really able to give local decision makers, hey, if you're building a wastewater treatment plant, based upon the projected sea level rise and the vulnerability of this facility and its lifespan, we can show you that what you need to build it to or where you should locate it so that it has the maximum lifespan with the least impact of sea level rise. That kind of planning, and as Ray was pointing out, the ability to get that in front of decision makers, I think helps us really start looking at climate as how we adapt. And I think this is the key thing at One Concern is we know that climate change is happening. We're focused on how are we going to adapt our communities to these impacts and make these long-term decisions, sometimes, having to make decisions about where and how we build at a resolution that decision makers can look at a project, not just a generality, but look at a project and go, how is this project going to be affected over its lifespan, using these tools to demonstrate what the potential impacts are, how that facility will perform, and if we built it differently than what we would plan to do, how that could change its ability to be resilient in the face of the climate factors.
All right, thank you. Here's a question for Al. What potential or future projects are you planning for LA now that you're on the One Concern platform?
Well, we think of a new one on a daily basis, honestly. We have weekly meetings where we sit down and we brainstorm the potential of what we can do with the software. So the preparedness module runs hundreds of earthquakes behind the scene, right? And it gives us holistically how a medium intensity earthquake will impact the city. But it is my understanding that this will, what One Concern will be releasing shortly is high impact earthquake scenarios. So, in this feature, what it would do, it would help us, and gives us insight of what's going to happen during a major disaster scenario. We can use that data for pre-positioning our resources. We will better understand the impacts on the critical infrastructure of the city, its lifelines, the cascading impacts. For example, the petroleum main lines that we have under the city, it's a concern of ours. There's only one jet fuel pipeline that runs to the airport, for example. We want to know what happens to that pipeline because it cuts off LAX, its operations. The critical infrastructure, as we talked about, we have identified 500 critical infrastructures that are very important for continuity of operations and government for the city. One thing that we're doing right now is we're going through our emergency plans for the different departments. Each department has a detailed emergency plan, and we're looking at their alternate locations. In case their primary location is impacted, they need to move out of their primary location and relocate, and we're basically testing to see if the alternate locations are realistic locations, and honestly we're finding out that in some instances no, the alternate locations will be damaged along with the primary locations. So again, that's very valuable information. We're using it, and we're thinking to use it more aggressively when it comes to community preparedness, and I touched on this. And we tried it. We tried it with a couple of the communities, and when they were able to visualize it, especially when in the downtown area where we showed some of the high rises and their impacts and the impact on the transportation system, it's an eye opener.
Thank you. Here's a question for Ray. How is One Concern different from what's already out there?
Yeah, so we get that question quite often, and that really is the technology that we're using. We are using state-of-the-art artificial intelligence technology that really isn't being used by anyone else in this space today that we're aware of. The technology, there are many products on the market today that frankly are products that take information and organize that information into what would be like a file cabinet, and then display that information, and then have some applications built on top of that based on human insight. The One Concern platform actually uses artificial intelligence, and as I spoke about earlier, and machine learning to go ahead and uncover insights that the artificial intelligence discovers in the information. Once all of those different dimensions of analysis take place, we actually have data scientists who go out and find data sets in order to increase those high levels of validation that come from the results of running the platform or simulations. So there really isn't another company doing that at the level that One Concern is today. There are quite a few companies that can provide you risk maps, but they're not dynamic risk maps using artificial intelligence that can provide the level of granularity and accuracy that we can, and then also, very frankly, that can change dynamically. So the example I'd like to give is most risk maps today in a live event are basically extrapolations of a prior model that had been built. So if you're looking at modeling taking place in the middle of a flood, people are taking a prior flood map and then extrapolating that out to events that are occurring. That's not how our platform actually works. With artificial intelligence and machine learning, what happens is our platform actually we have a hydrodynamic and hydrological rules in the platform, of course, but it listens to all the dynamic information coming in at that moment and actually creates a map live in the scenario. So you're not taking a prior map and sort of trying to fit it in as a puzzle piece, but rather you're getting a map that's created live in the moment for the event. And that's really a key difference in why we reach those levels of accuracies.
Here's a question that I've been wondering about since I first encountered One Concern and began to see what you all could do. Is it reasonable to think about linking the One Concern data set to epidemiological data so that you could deal with public health crises like, say, a hepatitis A outbreak like they had in San Diego?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very frankly, to go ahead, I think one of the amazing things about the platform is that you can go ahead and layer. You can layer current static risk maps on top of that, on top of the hazard scenarios, and then go ahead and figure out where you need to get to first in that scenario. I should probably let Craig speak to the public health threat and ARM speak to the public health threat that can occur in a natural hazard scenario. But we've been built for speed and efficiency to get to those areas as fast as possible.
Greg or Aram, do you want to react to that?
Well, this is Craig.
Yes. Go ahead, Craig.
Go ahead, Aram.
What we're doing right now, I can tell you that we are in the process of mapping out our encampments, our homeless encampments. We did not declare a state of emergency for the hepatitis A. San Diego did. LA County was very close of doing it, and we monitored it and introduced the hygiene centers and what have you. But we mapped out our homeless shelters, and then what the next step for us is to use the software to show impacts to these centers, not only when it comes to public health, but also during seismic activities to see which ones we need to relocate, evacuate, and shelter. So we are touching on that very slowly. Craig?
Yeah, I think this is, the thing about disease spread. When we look at the existing models and how we look at everything from Ebola to influenza pandemics, I think this is an area that is something that Benevolent AI is going to have a lot of impact on. Right now at One Concern, our primary focus has been on the natural hazards, earthquakes, floods, wildfires. As we continue to refine this technique and tools, we want to look at from an emergency management standpoint, we look at all hazards. And so as we begin moving beyond just the natural hazards world, this is, again, something that we are looking at. What is the potential to change outcomes? And again, our mission statement isn't about doing a better prediction on earthquakes or a better prediction about floods. It's about saving lives and changing outcomes. And so, again, I think there is a lot of applicability. We're still working through the existing hazard database that we're preparing for. But I think as we do this, we're going to learn how to better apply machine learning and AI across a variety of hazards and threats so that emergency managers have better situational awareness when events occur, but more importantly, better information about how to mitigate or eliminate, in some cases, risk by having that high resolution data available to them.
All right, thank you. Here's a question. I think this is probably for Ray. What is the licensing or subscription model for the One Concern platform?
So we are a software as a service company. We're a software as a service. We're a software as a service company. Sorry, I thought I had you on mute. And we actually, so what happens is that basically a jurisdiction will reach out to us and indicate that they're interested in procuring the platform, and then we sit down and try to figure out a duration of time that makes sense for the contract, such that we can go ahead and do and really achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve from a public policy and emergency response standpoint in their jurisdiction, and then figure out that it's the important thing to know is that the platform, the reason why we are a software as a service contract vehicle is because our data scientists are continuously updating our data sets. The built environment is constantly changing, and the blend of data that we need in order to achieve the levels of accuracy that we do need to be updated constantly. So it's not like purchasing a map and then you just have that map. It's a dynamic platform that changes with the built environment in jurisdictions. And frankly, some jurisdictions reach out to us because they realize that their data sets that they're keeping for their built environment frankly is not as accurate as they would like, and they realize that the data blend that we are constantly creating here is the best chance at getting that most accurate data set for them to use internally in their agency.
All right, for those in our audience who are interested in following up and requesting a demo, what do they need to do?
They can go ahead and they can go ahead and email me at ray@OneConcern, and I can go ahead and get them to the appropriate person here at our company.
All right, very good. I want to be respectful of our 1 hour commitment, so we're going to wrap it up here. In closing, I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's event. A big thank you goes to my fellow speakers, Craig Fugate, Ray Mueller, and Aram Sahakian. And a special thank you, of course, to our partners at One Concern for enabling us to bring this worthwhile discussion to our audience. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you soon at another governing event.